If I had a pound for every time after a by-election the party that does badly said, but it's a low turnout, and that's the explanation, I would be a rich person. Well, I think we learnt one thing new and had confirmation of two things old. So the one thing new is that the recent evidence in the opinion polls that there's been a rise in support for reform, whereas hitherto reform have not done very well in by-elections, never got more than about 6% and often got much less than that. In Kingswood, they got 10%. In Wellingborough, more Eurosceptic, they got 13%. Not enough, of course, to win the seat, but enough to confirm, seemingly, that they are now significant competitors for the votes of those who are discontented with the Conservative Party. And to that extent, at least, it now looks as though the Conservatives, rather than simply engaged in a battle with Labour for support, now also find themselves engaged in a potentially significant battle with Reform, who, of course, in the form of the Brexit Party, did not fight in Conservative constituencies back in 2019, but Richard Tice, their leader, is now determined they should do so, and therefore they potentially pose much more of a threat. What have we now confirmed? One, the Conservatives are in deep, deep electoral trouble. In Wellingborough, they suffered their biggest ever fall in support in a by-election they were trying to defend. Now, local circumstances may explain part of that, but even so, the fact that local circumstances led to such an outcome gives you an indication of the problems the party has. And we also learned that who are the beneficiaries of all of this? It's the Labour Party. Labour's vote is only going up by about half as much as the Conservative vote is going down. And again, you can see there the way that not all discontented Conservatives are going in Labour's direction. But that's more than enough to present Labour with two very substantial victories, most notably and most obviously in Wellingborough.
When the Conservatives point to the fact of a low turnout and it was a by-election, and Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg actually says in one constituency, if you put the Tory and Reform vote together, they would have won. How do you respond, Sir John?
Well, I mean, it is true that if you look at the detail of the result in Kingswood, you can reasonably argue that Labour's performance in the constituency was not as good as that Sir Tony Blair achieved when he was Prime Minister in the elections of 1997, 2001 and 2005. Although you cannot apply the same argument to Wellingborough. There, I think Labour basically more or less matched the Labour performances on the two occasions they picked it up in 1997 and 2001. But the truth is, Nick, if I had a pound for every time after a by-election the party that does badly said, but it's a low turnout, and that's the explanation, I would be a rich person. It's a fairly standard excuse. And to be honest, it never is very convincing. Even if it's true that Conservative voters were more likely to stay at home, that means you've got to find a reason to persuade them to turn up. And that, more broadly, I think, there is a problem about turnout. This is a parliament in which turnout has been falling more heavily than it has done in any previous parliament. The closest example is the parliament of 1997 to 2001, at the end of which turnout was 59%. I think we are at risk of having a low turnout at the next general election, and that's something that should be worrying all the parties. So far as governments losing by-elections are concerned, yes, of course they do. By-elections are often difficult for governments. However, governments don't usually lose by-elections on the swings of the size that we've seen in the last year or so. They also don't lose them with the regularity that we've seen during the course of this parliament, or at least we've not seen that since 1992 to 97, and we know what happened at the end of that parliament.
We've just got this reaction in from Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Let's quickly play this lastly to you, John.
Midterm by-elections are always difficult for incumbent governments, and the circumstances of these by-elections were, of course, particularly challenging. Now, I think if you look at the results, very low turnout, and it shows that we've got work to do to show people that we are delivering on their priorities, and that's what I'm absolutely determined to do, but also shows that there isn't a huge amount of enthusiasm for the alternative in Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, and that's because they don't have a plan. And if you don't have a plan, you can't deliver real change. And when the general election comes, that's the message I'll be making to the country. country. Stick with our plan because it is starting to deliver the change that the country wants and needs.
Sir John, it's almost as if you scripted it for Mr. Sunak. How do you respond to that? Exactly what you said.
Except I think what somebody might point out to the Prime Minister is question marks about his opening line. We are not in the midterm of this Parliament. We are perhaps no more than 9 months away from a general election.
Yes.
And the truth is that the opinion polls are telling us that basically the Conservative Party have failed to make any significant progress in repairing the damage that was inflicted on it by the Liz Truss fiscal event back in the autumn of 2022. And time is beginning to run out. Sure, the Conservative Party has got to try and do its best. Of course, I think what many people also know, to follow the Prime Minister's rhetoric, back at the time of the Conservative conference, he was trying to tell us that he was the person who was going to introduce change. Now he seems to be arguing, don't change horses for fear that the change might be worse than you've got already. That is, you can see one of the arguments that's made about the Prime Minister is he doesn't seem to come up with a consistent line of argument or appeal to the electorate. And that contrast, in a sense, perhaps indicates that the Conservatives are still finding it difficult to find a form of persuasion that can get voters back to voting for them.
Always enjoy speaking with you. Have a good weekend. Thank you. Professor Sir John Curtice, polling expert, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde.